Chapter 13. Lincoln woke to see sunlight on the wall, not sure where he was. When he heard the squeak of the oven door in the kitchen, he knew he was back at his second home, the Onos's. He sighed and smacked his lips, refreshed by the hard sleep that had left crust in his eyes. He yawned and opened his eyes wide to find himself face to face with a spider, large as a black, evil flower. He screamed and he slapped it away, stood up, and whacked at it with his jeans. In the corner of the room behind a wicker basket of clean clothes, Tony was laughing. "Oh no, it's a plastic spider." Lincoln looked down at the spider, frowning. He rolled it over with his toe. Then he picked it up and he flung it at Tony. "I thought I would come see if you were dead or alive," Tony said, coming out from behind the basket. "That's a dirty trick," Lincoln snapped. "You nearly scared me to death. It's a clean joke. A dirty joke would be if I brought you a real spider." Tony picked up Mitsu's glove, opened it like a mouth, and pounded his fist into it. "I got the lowdown about Mr. Ono." The lowdown was that Lincoln had driven the car down the narrow road at 5,000 feet to a 4-lane freeway at 1,000 feet and lived. Mr. Ono still lived too. He had been unconscious by the time they pulled into Ina and took him to the hospital. There he was laid up in fresh sheets while the boys slept in the car. Mrs. Ono took the train to Ina and the next day and brought the boys home along with her husband, whose arm was in a white sling. Lincoln put on his jeans and a clean San Francisco Giants t-shirt. He did a few deep knee bends and 5 push-ups. "Step back," Tony warned playfully. He bobbed and wove and threw a hook punch. "The vato is dangerous." Mitsu came into the bedroom and yelled, "Breakfast!" His hands were black and a smear darkened his nose. "How did you sleep, Link?" "Like a stone." What's that on your face?" "Grease, I guess." He swiped at the grease on his nose with the back of his hand. "I took off the fender." On the way down the mountain, Lincoln had run into a road sign, 2 fences, and a boulder that had fallen into the road. He almost ran into a cow. The car was damaged, with 1 fender buckled beyond repair, and the windshield was cracked like lightning. "The fender?" "Yeah, Dad wants us to take it to the junkyard. He has another one on order." The 3 went into the kitchen, and Mrs. Ono was cooking eggs and potatoes. "Good morning, hero," she said. "I made something special for you." She peeled back a dish towel to reveal a small stack of steaming tortillas. "Torts!" Lincoln and Tony shouted. Mr. Ono came in from the Angawa. Cigar smoke issued from his mouth in a big white O. "You smoke cigars?" Lincoln said. He was already slashing a blade of butter across his tortilla. "I'm celebrating my new life. I hear the spider bite was nothing compared to your crazy driving," he said jokingly. Mrs. Ono set the plates at the kitchen counter. "I called your mother," she said. "You are very lucky to have a nice mother." "My mother?" "Yes, I got the recipe for tortillas from your mother." She said, "Everything is nice. And I spoke to your dog, Flacco." "You spoke to him?" "Yes, he barked and I barked back." They laughed and pulled up their chairs. The tortillas disappeared in 100 jumps. After breakfast, Tony returned home, leaving Lincoln and Mitsu to take off the cracked windshield. They raised screwdrivers and began working at the rubber seal, careful not to rip it. Mr. Ono watched from the porch, basking in the rays of the morning sun. He drank his iced tea, sipping its coolness slowly, and he barked commands and chewed on his cigar, but not once did he get up to help. He was feeling as lazy as a cat stretched out in sunlight. After 20 minutes of surgery, the windshield popped off. Mitsu and Lincoln felt giddy. They wiped their sweaty faces and drank long and hard from the garden hose. "I have a nice surprise for you when you 2 come back," Mr. Ono said, an unlit cigarette dangling from his mouth. "So hurry, the surprise starts at 3. Lincoln and Mitsu tied a rope on the fender and placed the windshield on top of it. They dragged their improvised sleigh of car parts up the street. Children followed them, begging for a ride. Dogs followed as well, and an old woman who came out of her house with her hands over her ears. She shouted that the noise of metal against asphalt was driving her crazy. She threw a small stone at the boys, but they only laughed and hurried away. At the junkyard at the edge of town, Lincoln and Mitsu nursed Sodas, their shirts sticky with sweat, their arms sore, and their palms raw from the rope. The owner came out from the shed and, eyeing the windshield and the fender, muttered in Japanese that the stuff was junk and a tragedy for the environment. Junk? Yeah, but quality junk. It came off my dad's Honda, Mitsu argued. He knew he wasn't going to get much for the car parts, but it didn't hurt to play it up a little. The owner waved Mitsu off and opened his wallet, which was closed with rubber bands. He gave Mitsu a handful of yen. Mitsu was going to argue, but the owner's dog began to sniff their legs, growling and baring its fangs all the way to his pinkish gums. Nice doggy, Lincoln said as he stepped backwards. Be cool, be cool. The boys backed out of the junkyard, whistling pleasant tunes. They returned home and told Mitsu's father that the junk man was cheap. Even his wallet was held together by rubber bands. Mr. Ono was in the garden playing a round of backyard golf. The golf club was rusty, and his single golf ball was chipped and yellow as an old tooth. I'm on vacation. I can't worry about money, he said, concentrating on his putt and the dent in the earth 20 feet away. He swung the club, and the ball raced like a mouse under a cabbage leaf. He looked at the boys and said, I need practice. Give me a couple hours, and you'll see. Mitsu chased the ball for his father and returned it by rolling it back. Lincoln stopped the golf ball by trapping it under his shoe. You said you had a surprise for us, Mitsu said. Yes, a surprise, Mr. Ono said. He brought out his wallet, which was also held closed together with rubber bands. He chuckled and said, I'm like the junk man. He handed Lincoln and Mitsu each a ticket. Sumo wrestling, Lincoln-kun. It starts at 3 o'clock. Tough, Lincoln said, studying the kanji on the ticket. Those dudes are heavy. Thanks. 400 pounds, Mitsu said, and sometimes even 500 pounds. Lincoln and Mitsu arrived at 2:30 at the city auditorium, where spectators, mostly men, crowded for seats. The two overhead air conditioners strained to cool the room. The spectators grunted and muttered when 4 sumo wrestlers came out wearing purple loincloths. So loincloths just cover the private areas for the men. I think you can still see their buttocks, I believe. Their hair was pulled back and knotted into buns. Each wrestler had a towel that looked as small as a washcloth on his huge shoulders. Lincoln was impressed. He could see that the wrestlers were strong and powerful. Their legs and bellies wiggled with fat. But Lincoln was sure that underneath, muscle twisted like steel cables. And he was sure by the way that they walked that these men were warriors. The contest is short, maybe a minute, Mitsu explained. The object is to push your opponent out of the ring. The canvas circle was a ring, unroped, raised, and set under a tasseled canopy. A referee in a ceremonial kimono stepped into the ring and bowed deeply to the spectators. He was followed by 2 wrestlers who stared at each other, their eyes narrowed. They clapped their hands, slapped their thighs and stomachs. They feigned attacks. They stomped their bare feet. They threw a white powdery dust into the air and clapped at the dust. So this you can consider something called pomps and circumstance. So it's just like all these different ritual pieces, but really they're not doing any fighting per se. They're not really wrestling at this point. The spectators grew restless with anticipation. The bout began with the wrestlers bowing to the audience and to each other. They stomped their feet, circled, and feinted. Then they were at each other, chest to sweating chest, knocking each other so hard that their muscles quivered. And as soon as the bout began, it was over. The bigger of the 2 wrestlers was knocked out of the ring. He stepped off the platform, wiped his sweaty neck, and Lincoln guessed was relieved that he hadn't been crushed. The winning sumo wrestler bowed to the applauding crowd, some of whom were on their feet cheering. Man, that was quick, Lincoln said to Mitsu. It looks easy, but it's not. 2 other sumo wrestlers entered the ring and began pacing from one side of the ring to the other. They too clapped their hands and slapped their stomachs, and as the anticipation rose, the crowd fanning itself into a sweaty storm of emotion, the referee bowed and introduced the players. One was from Tokyo and the other from Osaka. The sumo wrestlers bowed deeply and then circled each other. The player from Tokyo won in 33 seconds. Or so Lincoln counted on his watch. Man, you can't blink, Lincoln said. If you blink, you lose, Mitsu said. They're bad, but I'd hate to be that big. I'd have to shop at the big and tall shop. Yes, they are large, too large. They say a sumo wrestler can eat 12 bowls of ramen and still be hungry. That's a lot of noodles. They watched 4 matches and started home, each with a bottle of soda and a comic book of sumo wrestlers autographed by one of the wrestlers who had been thrown out of the ring. At home before dinner, Lincoln and Mitsu wrestled sumo style with their shirts off. They grunted and sweated and smashed against each other's chests. Red welts blossomed on their arms, and their toes were stepped on and heads knocked together. Mr. Ono, shirt off, watched the boys from the Ingawa and waved away flies. Cheap entertainment for a poor railroad man, he said, his cigarette glowing in the early dusk.